In the mist-covered forests of hollow pines, a weary veteran named Caleb stood before the moss-covered cabin he'd inherited, a place the locals called the house that breathed. All he wanted was silence, a corner of peace for him and his loyal dog, Echo. But when the walls began to whisper and the creek behind the cabin shimmered green like poison, he realized the house wasn't haunted. It was crying for justice. Beneath its floorboards slept the truth of a man who had died for it. And when the house finally breathed again, it wasn't a ghost that spoke. It was God's mercy, carried by the wind. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a slow, relentless weeping that turned the roads of northern Oregon into veins of mud and glass. The small town of Ashmere Hollow lay crouched beneath a ceiling of cloud, its wooden storefronts dark with damp, its neon signs blinking weakly like eyes too tired to stay open. The air carried the scent of wet cedar and diesel, the kind of smell that clings to a man's clothes long after he's left the forest. Caleb Harlow, age 46, guided his dented Ford truck up the winding hill that led out of town. He had the solid, weather-carved look of a man who had lived too many lives in one skin. Tall, broad-shouldered but lean, his face a map of old battles. A short beard of silver and black framed a jaw too stubborn to yield, and his gray eyes, pale as morning frost, carried a quiet fatigue that belonged to someone who had seen too much of the world's blood. A long scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only visible souvenir from Afghanistan, where he had served as a combat medic before the war had finally emptied him out. He wasn't running from ghosts, only from silence that had grown too loud. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Echo, his 5-year-old German shepherd, a muscular creature with a thick coat mottled in black and silver, the color of a storm cloud brushed with ash. Echo had the stillness of a seasoned soldier. He didn't bark without cause, didn't flinch at thunder, and seemed to understand the weight behind every word Caleb never said. A faint streak of white ran from the dog's brow to the tip of his nose, giving him the look of an old warrior wearing war paint. His amber eyes watched the mist outside with quiet intelligence, reflecting the glow of the truck's dashboard. When Caleb reached out and scratched behind his ear, the dog leaned subtly into the touch, a silent acknowledgement between two survivors who no longer needed language. The road narrowed as it climbed higher into the hills, where the forest thickened into a cathedral of firs and moss-draped branches. The headlights swept across a crooked wooden sign at the fork. Green Widow Cabin, private property. Caleb slowed, squinting through the haze. The name meant little to him, though the realtor's letter had mentioned it twice, an inheritance of sorts, from an old acquaintance of his late commanding officer. The papers were already signed. The property was his. He told himself it would be temporary. Fix it up, sell it, move on. But the rain made the world feel endless, and the thought of 4 walls that weren't rented felt like a small, guilty mercy. When he turned onto the gravel drive, the forest seemed to swallow him whole. The cabin emerged from the mist like something half-remembered, small, stooped, its roof sagging under the weight of emerald moss that shimmered in the drizzle. The walls were dark pine logs, swollen with moisture, the window panes filmed with fog and age. It looked less like a house and more like a creature that had decided to sleep for 100 years. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, landing with a hollow plink in a rusted bucket below. Echo let out a low growl, not of fear, but of curiosity, and raised his nose to the air. The moss along the walls rippled faintly in the wind, moving as if the house were breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations that stirred the green like fur. Caleb killed the engine. The silence that followed was so deep it pressed against his ribs. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the cold, wet air. His boots sank into the spongy earth, and the smell of moss and wood rot filled his lungs. He tilted his head, listening. The cabin sighed, or so it seemed, as a draft whistled through the gaps in its logs. He let out a humorless chuckle. "Breathing, huh?" he muttered. "That's just humidity, pal." Echo trotted ahead, paws barely making a sound, tail flicking like a metronome. The dog stopped at the porch, nose pressed against the warped doorframe, then looked back as if waiting for permission to enter. Inside, the air was heavy and cool. Dust motes floated through the beam of Caleb's flashlight, glittering like trapped fireflies. The single-room interior held only the bare remnants of a life long gone. A broken chair, a stone fireplace blackened by time, a warped table half sunk into the floorboards. In the corner, an old iron stove leaned drunkenly against the wall, and above it, a line of dried moss traced the shape of a handprint, vivid and green. Caleb ran his thumb across it. Damp. Alive. He frowned, then heard a faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the rafters. The sound was almost human in its persistence, a slow heartbeat echoing through the hollow space. Echo padded toward the sound, ears forward. His claws clicked on the boards until he stopped near the center of the room. His tail stiffened. A soft, rumbling bark escaped his throat. Caleb knelt beside him, shone the flashlight upward. A droplet fell from the ceiling, landed squarely on the beam of light, and burst like a tear. There was no hole, no visible leak, only the faint movement of moss along the outer roof, rising and falling in rhythm with the wind. The illusion was uncanny. Later that evening, after unpacking a sleeping bag and coaxing a reluctant flame in the fireplace, Caleb sat on the floor eating canned beans straight from the tin. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, and the forest had fallen into its nocturnal hush. He replayed the warning the hardware store clerk had given him that afternoon, a wiry man with nicotine-yellowed fingers who'd said, "Don't stay up there after dark, stranger. That cabin breathes. People hear it talk." Caleb had laughed then, too tired to argue. He didn't believe in hauntings. He believed in bad plumbing and wood expansion. But now, with the wind threading through the cracks, and Echo watching the doorway as if, expecting someone to step in, he felt the faintest pull of unease. He reached for his canteen, took a slow sip, and leaned his head back against the log wall. "Just moisture," he whispered. "That's all." Echo's ears twitched at his voice but didn't relax. The fire popped, scattering sparks that briefly illuminated the moss creeping along the windowsill, green veins glowing in the orange light. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to exhale, a deep, slow gust that rustled the curtains, though no door had opened. Caleb closed his eyes, exhaling too, letting exhaustion drag him down. The last sound he heard before sleep claimed him was the rhythm of dripping water and the faint sigh of a house that refused to die. The second night in Green Widow Cabin was colder than the first. The rain had passed, but the mist clung to the forest like a stubborn ghost, swallowing the moonlight before it could reach the ground. Inside, the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a dull orange glow across the warped wooden floor. Caleb lay half awake in his sleeping bag, listening to the house breathe. The sound was subtle at first, a faint rhythm of water dropping somewhere in the dark. Tack, 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 measured and deliberate like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living thing. Echo stirred beside him, lifting his head from his paws. The German shepherd's ears pricked forward, muscles tensing under his silvery black coat. He gave a low, uneasy rumble, not fear, not warning, something closer to confusion. Caleb rolled over, rubbing his eyes. "It's just condensation, boy," he muttered, voice hoarse from disuse. But even as he said it, the sound changed. The steady dripping slowed, then began again from a different corner of the cabin. Caleb sat up and turned on the small camping lantern beside him. Its harsh white light scattered shadows across the walls. He followed the sound, his bare feet pressing against cold wood. There was no visible leak. The roof above was solid except for a few seams of damp moss glistening under the lamplight. He crouched, pressed a palm to the floorboards, and felt nothing but chill. Echo padded forward, sniffing intently, tail low but wagging in slow, uncertain sweeps. The dog's nose traced a line from the fireplace toward the center of the room, where the boards had darkened slightly from age. Echo stopped there, sat down, and looked up at Caleb with patient insistence. The dripping continued, steady and precise, like something mechanical beneath the surface. He fetched a small crowbar from his duffel bag, an old habit from years of field work where every sound could mean danger, and pried up a single plank. Beneath was only a crawl space, no more than a foot deep, full of damp earth and spider webs. The smell was stronger now, thick with mildew and the faint tang of iron. Caleb leaned closer, shining the light into the hollow. Something metallic glinted far back in the shadows. He reached in, fingers brushing cold soil until they hit metal. A nail, bent and old. Nothing else. He exhaled sharply, frustrated. "Ghosts don't use plumbing," he murmured, setting the plank back into place. Echo didn't move. The dog's gaze had shifted toward the corner near the window, where the curtains hung limp and wet from the earlier rain. Caleb turned his light that way, half expecting to see another puddle, but the boards were dry. Then, the dripping stopped entirely. The silence that followed was thick and alive, a suffocating stillness that seemed to hum against the walls. Caleb straightened, feeling his pulse in his ears. Echo let out a soft whine and backed closer to him, tail brushing against his leg. The man rested a reassuring hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur. "Easy, soldier," he said quietly. The wind outside shifted, brushing through the trees like an invisible hand. Somewhere deep in the cabin's frame, the wood groaned as if exhaling. Caleb tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, a slow, cavernous inhalation followed by a faint, airy sigh. The boards beneath his feet quivered almost imperceptibly. It was as though the entire house were drawing breath. For a long moment he stood motionless, his rational mind clawing for an explanation. Air pressure, wind tunnels, structural movement, but nothing fit. He crouched again, pressing his ear to the cold floor. The vibration was stronger now, a hollow rhythm pulsing from below. He fetched the lantern and crossed to the fireplace. The soot-stained bricks rose high to a chimney too narrow for anything larger than smoke. Yet as he leaned in, he heard it again. The slow inhale, the faint whistle of exhale, the cadence of something alive. He thrust the light up the flue, expecting to see movement, maybe a trapped bird or animal, but the beam found only wet stone and the shimmer of moss growing even inside the chimney's throat. He pulled back, coughing at the damp air. Echo suddenly barked, once, sharp and commanding. Caleb spun, the light swinging wildly. The dog stood rigid, facing the front door, fur bristling along his spine. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass panes like a living wall, distorting the view of the forest. No footsteps, no sound of approach, just the deep, expectant hush. The barking ceased as quickly as it began. Echo trotted toward the door, nose twitching, then sat down as if waiting for something to arrive. Caleb stared for a long moment, feeling the prickle of instinct that had saved him more than once overseas. He double-checked the locks, rusted but intact, and slid the bolt shut. The drip started again, faint but now coming from under the old stove instead of the roof. Caleb approached, crouched low, and shone the light beneath. There was nothing visible except darkness, but the smell hit him stronger than before. Metal, wet earth, and something faintly sweet, like decaying leaves. He pushed a handkerchief over his mouth. The dog sniffed the same spot and gave a low growl, then stepped back. Caleb felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Something's dead under there," he whispered. But even as he said it, the drip stopped again. Silence returned, and the house seemed to settle, as though satisfied. He cleaned the soot off his hands and sat by the cold hearth, listening to the wind thread through the cracks. The rhythmic pulse faded until only the forest's breathing remained. Echo lay beside him, head resting on his knee, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Caleb stroked the dog's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat under his palm. "Maybe it's just us two hearts tonight," he said softly. But as he closed his eyes, he swore he heard it again. Faint, patient, the slow inhale of the moss-covered walls around him, as if the cabin itself were listening back. Morning came slow and gray, filtering through the cabin's fogged windows like the breath of an exhausted ghost. The rain had stopped, but the world outside still glistened as if newly made. Caleb sat at the small wooden table, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, while Echo gnawed lazily on a stick by the door. The silence of Green Widow Cabin felt different in daylight, less like a warning, more like a memory whispering through the walls. He was halfway through his second sip when a sudden knock broke the stillness. 3 short raps, deliberate, businesslike. Echo sprang up at once, tail stiff, ears pointed toward the sound. Caleb frowned, set his mug aside, and opened the door. A man stood on the porch, tall and narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a long brown raincoat darkened by damp. His age was hard to pin, perhaps late 50s, but the fine lines etched around his mouth suggested a lifetime spent squinting at small print. He had thinning blonde-gray hair, combed neatly back, and a precise, almost surgical manner of movement. His voice, when he spoke, carried a polished calm. "Mr. Caleb Harlow?" he asked. Caleb nodded warily. "Name's Thomas Leland," the man continued, pulling an envelope from his leather satchel. "Attorney out of Tillamook. I'm handling the Greer estate." He tapped the envelope lightly. "This was forwarded to you. Handwritten, sealed, and postmarked from 1972, but it's been held in record custody ever since." Caleb took the envelope, its paper yellowed and soft with age. "That's half a century," he said. "Why now?" Leland's pale blue eyes flicked toward the house behind him, lingering for a moment as if assessing its weight. "The estate file was recently unsealed under dormant property law. Your ownership triggered the release clause. I'm only the messenger." His tone carried no curiosity, only duty. He looked like the kind of man who lived his life by clean lines and fine print. Caleb thanked him, though suspicion tugged at his chest. The lawyer nodded once, glanced at Echo with mild apprehension, and turned to leave. Echo watched him until his figure dissolved into the mist. Caleb sat back at the table, the envelope before him like a relic. He hesitated before tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, its edges browned. The handwriting was sharp and confident. "To whoever finds this place, the cabin is not cursed, it is alive. I built it with my own hands, and it listens. If you hear it breathe, do not fear it. It remembers. Elias Greer, Carpenter, 1972. Caleb let out a slow breath and leaned back. "Alive," he muttered. Sure. He folded the letter carefully, eyes tracing the ink as if it might rearrange into something sensible. Elias Greer, the name sounded familiar from the property deed, but nothing more. He imagined an eccentric old man with calloused hands and a mind frayed by isolation. The kind of soul who whispered to wood because no one else would listen. Still, something in the handwriting, the steady, deliberate strokes, didn't read like madness. It read like conviction. Echo padded over, his fur brushing Caleb's arm, nose twitching at the paper. No, it's not food, Caleb said, smiling faintly. The dog ignored him, gaze fixed on the fireplace. He walked there, tail low, and began sniffing along the floorboards. Caleb frowned. Again? He followed, crouching beside him. The boards near the hearth were darker, damp with a faint green sheen of moss. Echo began pawing at the spot, scraping gently, sending up a faint, earthy smell. Easy, Caleb murmured, but the dog persisted, his claws catching at something soft. A clump of moss peeled away, revealing a thin seam in the wood, a narrow line Caleb hadn't noticed before. He pressed against it. The board gave slightly. Beneath was the faintest draft, cool and steady, like air escaping a buried lung. He reached for his multi-tool and pried gently until the plank lifted with a groan. Echo backed up, eyes wide, tail wagging in short bursts of excitement. Beneath the plank was a hollow space, no larger than a shoebox, lined with damp soil and bits of crumbled paper. Caleb swept his flashlight over it. The beam caught on a small, rusted hinge and the corner of something metallic. He reached in carefully, fingertips brushing the cold surface, and pulled out a small tin box, its lid fused shut by oxidation. The smell of wet iron rose as he wiped it clean. The box bore the faint engraving of initials, E.G. for Elias Greer. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Well, Elias," he said under his breath, "what were you hiding?" The box rattled faintly when he shook it, the contents shifting inside like old bones, but the lid refused to open. He set it down on the hearthstone and tried a small screwdriver under the edge. A soft crack, and the seal broke. Inside were 3 folded pages bound by twine, water-stained but legible. The first was a crude sketch of the cabin's floor plan. The second, a list of construction materials with notes in the margin, measurements, repairs, something about hollow joists. The third was a short scrawled message. "If the house breathes, it is because the forest lends it breath. I built her bones from trees that never fell willingly. She remembers the axe." Caleb felt an involuntary chill crawl along his arms. He looked around at the cabin, the green on the walls, the way the moss reached through every crack, as though reclaiming what once belonged to it. Echo sniffed the tin box again, then lay down beside it with a quiet huff, as if guarding something sacred. Caleb rubbed a hand over his beard. "You and your poetry, Elias," he murmured, folding the papers back. But as he did, the faint tack of dripping resumed somewhere deep under the floor, softer this time, almost like a reply. That night, long after he'd sealed the hollow and put away the letter, Caleb lay awake listening. The house breathed again, slower, steadier, almost peaceful. He tried to convince himself it was just air pressure through the crawl space, but when the wind shifted, he could swear the rhythm changed, matching the calm rise and fall of his own chest, as if the cabin were trying to breathe with him. The rain returned by evening, thin and steady, the kind that never seemed to end, but never grew strong enough to wash anything clean. The smell of wet pine filled the cabin, blending with the lingering scent of rust and smoke. Caleb sat at the small table, the tin box from the day before open before him, its contents spread out. Sketches, yellowed notes, fragments of thought from a man who had vanished 50 years ago. Echo lay nearby, head on his paws, watching him with those amber eyes that seemed too old for a creature his age. Every few minutes, the dog's ears flicked toward the same spot near the coffee table where the floor met shadow. Caleb didn't notice at first. His mind was caught on the cryptic line, "The house breathes because the forest lends it breath." When the lantern flame began to flicker low, Caleb rubbed his temples and leaned back in the chair. "All right, Elias," he muttered. "If you built this place to whisper, I'm listening." He closed the box and reached for his jacket. The wind outside sighed through the trees, and the walls creaked in slow reply. That was when he heard it. 3 dull, hollow knocks. Tock, 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 rising from beneath the floorboards under the coffee table. It wasn't loud, but distinct enough to freeze him mid-breath. Echo lifted his head immediately, body tense, nose pointing toward the sound. Caleb crouched beside the table, pressing his palm to the boards. They were cool and damp. When he rapped his knuckles against the wood, the tone was empty, resonant, different from the rest of the floor. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. Echo whined softly and began to scratch at the edge of the rug, pulling it aside to reveal the bare planks. His claws tapped lightly as he sniffed, tail stiff but not afraid. The dog's nose stopped over a single plank that looked subtly newer, its grain finer, its stain fresher than the rest of the aged floor. Caleb frowned. "You really don't quit, do you?" he said, half smiling despite the chill running down his spine. He retrieved his screwdriver and gently pried at the board. It resisted at first, then gave with a sighing creak. A puff of cold, damp air escaped from the narrow gap, so cold it felt like a living breath against his fingers. He paused, listening. The dripping had stopped again, replaced by that same steady pulse of silence that seemed to have a rhythm of its own. He eased the board free, revealing a square cavity no larger than a milk crate. Inside was darkness and the faint glimmer of something metallic. Echo edged closer, nose twitching, tail wagging once as if to say, "This is it." Caleb shone the lantern inside. A small box lay within, its surface mottled green with corrosion, corners eaten by time. He reached in, lifted it carefully, heavier than expected, and set it on the table. Moisture beaded across its lid, and the faint odor of earth and iron rose with it. He tried the latch, but it was sealed with a thin film of rust. "Let's see what's worth hiding twice," he murmured. With the same screwdriver, he worked the edge until the lock cracked open, flakes of rust scattering across the wood. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper gone brittle with age, were more sketches and one folded sheet with a bold red circle drawn in thick pencil. The circle marked a point at the north wall, where the outer logs met the ground. Beneath it, in tight block letters, Elias Greer had written, "She breathes from here." Caleb felt a shiver climb the back of his neck. He unfolded the other papers, handwritten measurements, notes about airflow, and one disturbing entry in uneven handwriting. "If anyone hears her sigh, follow the breath. The truth is buried where the cold never leaves." He leaned back, staring at the north wall. Moss crept thickly there, greener than anywhere else, the boards slick with moisture. Echo followed his gaze, ears pricked. The dog padded over, pressed his nose against the lower log, then barked once, short, sharp, certain. Caleb joined him, crouched down, running his fingers along the baseboard. The wood was colder here, the air damp. He tapped once. "Talk." The same hollow resonance answered. "You're onto something," he whispered. Before he could examine further, lightning flashed through the fogged windows, followed by the deep growl of thunder. The lantern flickered, then went out, plunging the room into blue darkness. For several seconds, only the sound of rain filled the space. Then, faintly, from beneath the north wall came a new sound. Not dripping this time, but a long, hollow exhale, as though the cabin itself were sighing in relief that its secret had been found. Echo growled low, not aggressive but wary, tail swaying like a metronome of tension. Caleb struck a match, relit the lantern, and whispered, "It's just wind, boy." But his voice wavered, betraying disbelief. He stared at the red circle on the paper, then at the damp wall, realization dawning like frost creeping over glass. Elias Greer hadn't been warning anyone. He'd been leaving directions. Directions to something hidden beneath the cabin, something the house itself was guarding. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. The storm raged outside, hammering against the roof. Yet beneath it all, he still heard the subtle rhythm of breath rising from the north wall. Steady, patient, waiting. Echo lay beside him, ears twitching at every gust, his gaze never leaving that dark corner of the room. The cabin was no longer silent. It was listening. The rain finally broke the next morning, leaving behind a washed-out silence and the scent of earth newly awakened. Mist rose from the trees as Caleb guided his old Ford down the winding road toward town. Echo sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, nose twitching at the smell of wet cedar and smoke from distant chimneys. Caleb's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The night's discovery, the red circle, the breath from the north wall, lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. The tin box and Elias Greer's sketches lay folded carefully in the glove compartment beside him. If anyone in this forgotten corner of Oregon knew what those papers meant, it would be the keeper of the town's memory. The librarian. The Hollow Pines Public Library sat at the edge of Main Street, a red brick building half swallowed by ivy and decades of neglect. Its sign hung crooked over the door, the gold lettering almost erased by time. When Caleb pushed the heavy oak doors open, a small bell tinkled faintly, the sound oddly comforting after days of the cabin's eerie breathing. Inside smelled of dust, old paper, and lemon polish. Rows of tall wooden shelves rose like pews, their spines faded into the same shade of brown. Behind the main counter sat a thin, elderly woman sorting a stack of returned books with the slow precision of a clockmaker. Marion Doss was 70, though she carried herself with the upright grace of someone who had once danced on stage. Her frame was slight, her gray hair tied into a neat bun that revealed the delicate bones of her face. Her skin was pale but unwrinkled, except at the corners of her mouth, where fine lines deepened when she smiled, something she did sparingly. Round spectacles, polished to a mirror shine, magnified her sharp blue eyes. She wore a dark green cardigan over a long brown skirt, her thin fingers stained slightly with ink. There was a calm, measured rhythm to her movements, the kind that comes from decades spent listening more than speaking. Caleb removed his cap, brushing rain from his jacket as he approached. "Ma'am, I'm looking for information about a man named Elias Greer," he began. "He was a carpenter, lived around here in the early 70s. Marion looked up slowly, studying him with a librarian's quiet suspicion. "You're not from here," she said, her voice low and steady, touched with a faint mountain drawl. "People don't ask about Elias Greer unless they have reason to." Caleb hesitated, then offered the folded sketches. "I found these in the house he built. Green Widow Cabin." The moment she read the name, her posture changed. Her eyes flicked from the papers to Caleb's face. "That cabin still stands?" she asked. "Barely," he replied. "I'm trying to piece together what happened to him." Marion adjusted her glasses and spread the papers across the counter. The red circle, the measurements, the strange notations, all reflected in her lenses as she leaned closer. "I remember him," she said finally, her tone softer now, shaded with regret. "Elias was quiet, kept to himself, but he came here often, always asking for government reports, environmental studies, chemical registries. Folks thought he was odd, but I knew better. He was scared." Caleb frowned. "Scared of what?" Marion closed the sketchbook and met his eyes. "Hollow Pines Timber," she said simply. They owned most of the land back then, including the logging routes that fed into the valley. Around 71, Elias started making noise, said the company was dumping waste into the creek that ran behind his cabin. He claimed it was turning the water green. She paused, her gaze distant. Then one morning in 72, the creek really did turn green. People thought it was algae. By nightfall, Elias Greer was gone. She led him to a narrow aisle at the back of the library, where a single file cabinet leaned against the wall. Its drawers were labeled by hand in fading ink. She pulled one open and extracted a brittle newspaper clipping sealed in plastic. The headline read, "Local Carpenter Missing. Sheriff Ends Search." Beneath it was a photo of Elias Greer, grainy but clear, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with kind eyes and a carpenter's rough hands. "They never found him," Marion said. "No body, no tools, nothing. The sheriff called it an accident, said he probably fell into the river. But some of us knew better." Caleb studied the photograph. Elias looked like the kind of man who built things to last. "You said he was scared," Caleb pressed. "Did he ever say why?" Marion hesitated, glancing toward the front door as if to make sure no one was listening. "He told me once," she said quietly, "that he'd found proof, papers, samples, something hidden near the north side of the cabin. He was going to take it to Portland, but he never made it that far. The next morning, Hollow Pines Timber filed a claim to the land around his property." She handed the clipping to Caleb. "If you found his plans, then maybe the proof's still there. That red circle. It's not a design mark, it's a burial site." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, but she straightened quickly, returning to her librarian calm. "Be careful, Mr. Harlow. Hollow Pines is still around, different owners, same habits. People who dig into old things here tend to disappear like Elias did." Caleb nodded, tucking the papers back into his jacket. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll be careful." Marion's thin fingers brushed his sleeve before he turned. "Listen to the house," she said softly. "Elias always said it would tell the truth to whoever had the courage to hear it." Outside, the mist had thickened again, curling through the trees like pale smoke. Caleb climbed into his truck, Echo already waiting in the passenger seat. As he started the engine, the creek beyond the road came into view, a ribbon of water glinting faintly green beneath the morning sun. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening under a muted sun. The air was heavy with that sharp, metallic scent that comes after rain, the smell of renewal mixed with rot. Caleb parked his truck beside the cabin and stepped out with Echo trotting at his side. The dog shook the water from his fur, droplets catching the light like shards of glass. The air was cold enough to see his own breath. The house stood silent before him, soaked dark with moisture, green moss shimmering along its logs like veins under skin. Caleb paused at the porch, running his hand along the damp railing. "You've been breathing again, haven't you?" he murmured. The words were half a jest, half a challenge. Inside, he unpacked a small kit from his truck. An old field recorder, directional microphone, anemometer, and a flashlight. He'd used these tools once in war zones to capture the faint tremors of distant mortars. Now he was using them to listen to a house. Echo followed close, his tail low but wagging faintly, eyes bright with curiosity. The German shepherd's coat had deepened in color from the rain, and when he shook himself, the cabin's dust rose in tiny storms. Caleb crouched beside the fireplace, adjusting the microphone near the chimney's base. He watched the needle on the recorder twitch as wind began to stir outside, a faint moan threading through the air. The sound grew deeper, fuller, vibrating the glass panes like the resonant note of a flute made from bone. He moved next to the wall vents and set the second microphone by the northern baseboard. The wind shifted again, blowing in from the west, and the two devices hummed in harmony, a strange duet of breath and wood. Caleb checked the readings, then smiled slightly. "Helmholtz resonance," he whispered. "That's what you are." He scribbled notes in a small waterproof pad. The decayed chimney and the narrow cracks along the rafter were forming natural resonating chambers. When the wind passed through them at a precise velocity, it created a deep tone that pulsed like inhalation. The same effect caused by air whistling over a bottle's rim. The cabin wasn't haunted. It was singing to the wind. Still, the explanation didn't entirely comfort him. The resonance didn't explain everything, especially not the shifting focus of the sound. The microphones near the northern wall showed irregular fluctuations, almost like a heartbeat embedded in the background noise. Echo's ears flicked toward the wall, tail stiffening. He walked over, nose pressed to the seam of the logs, breathing in shallow sniffs. His hackles rose slightly, not in fear, but in alert recognition. Caleb frowned and followed, pressing his palm against the wood. It was cold, damp, and faintly trembling under his touch. The rhythmic pulse was slower now, almost deliberate. "That's not wind," he muttered. He stepped outside, circling the cabin to the north. The slope behind the house dipped toward a line of pines and a narrow creek that glinted green in the dim light. The ground was soft, spongy, covered in thick moss that squelched under his boots. Caleb crouched near the wall's foundation, examining the base where the wood met soil. The moss was thicker here, a dense carpet of emerald that shimmered with moisture. He brushed it back carefully and found what looked like an old vent, half rusted, half hidden. The slats were clogged with dirt and fibrous roots. Air pushed faintly through the openings, cold enough to sting his skin. "Breathe, huh?" he whispered, crouching lower. He cleared the vent, and as the obstruction fell away, a long sigh escaped the cavity, a sound so human it made him step back. Echo barked once, short and sharp, then fell silent, nose tilted toward the vent. Caleb steadied his breathing. The airflow increased briefly, then steadied, producing that same low, resonant hum. He realized the vent wasn't connected to any visible duct. It led downward, toward something under the cabin. "So that's where you're hiding," he said softly. That evening, as the sun bled into a pale orange haze, Caleb reviewed the recordings. The spectral analysis on his laptop showed 2 frequency bands. One matched the expected airflow resonance, but the second, deeper, intermittent, was irregular. It pulsed with a pattern too complex to be wind alone. It started every time the outer vent was clear and faded whenever he blocked it. He leaned back, rubbing his beard, mind racing. The cabin wasn't haunted, but it wasn't just wind either. Something beneath the north wall was acting like a second chamber, a cavity large enough to hold pressure, maybe even a sealed room. Echo settled beside him, resting his head on Caleb's boot, eyes trained on the same wall. The dog gave a low, soft whine, tail tapping once against the floorboards. Caleb looked at him and smiled wearily. "Yeah, I know," he said. "We're not done yet." He turned off the recorder, but the silence that followed was anything but empty. Through the logs, through the floor, through the night itself, the faint hum of the house continued. A slow, patient rhythm, neither ghost nor mere physics. It was waiting, and now Caleb knew how to listen. Morning came cold and colorless, the kind of gray that never quite became day. A faint mist hung low across the yard as Caleb stood by the northern wall, crowbar in hand. The air smelled of wet moss and iron. Echo sat a few feet away, his breath puffing little clouds in the chill, ears perked but patient. Caleb had spent the night replaying the recordings, the second pulse, the strange rhythm beneath the floor. Now he knew what he had to do. He wedged the crowbar into the seam of the outer planks and pried. The first board cracked loose with a dry groan, splinters flaring like bones from an old wound. Beneath the surface, the wood was newer, smoother, its color only slightly faded. Someone had repaired this part decades after the rest of the cabin was built. Caleb peeled away another plank, revealing a narrow cavity stuffed with matted insulation and a layer of dirt-caked paper. His flashlight cut a pale cone through the gloom. The beam caught a dull metallic gleam, a small cast-iron safe, wedged neatly between the studs. Its surface was rough with rust, but a manufacturer's engraving was still visible. Everlast Security Comforces, 1968. He brushed away the dust. The circular dial barely turned, its metal corroded and frozen from years of moisture. Caleb sat back on his heels, exhaling a long, weary breath. "You sure know how to pick your secrets, Elias," he muttered. Echo nosed the safe curiously, then sneezed, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Caleb thought briefly of trying the lock himself, then dismissed the idea. He needed someone who understood old things, someone who still remembered when craftsmanship was done by hand. That meant a visit to the edge of Hollow Pines, where an old locksmith named Arthur Bennett still lived. Arthur Bennett had been working locks longer than Caleb had been alive. When he opened his door, he looked like a ghost of the town's past, tall and wiry, with skin the color of parchment and hands that trembled only when idle. His hair, what little remained, was the dull white of unpolished steel, and his beard framed a long, angular face creased deep around the eyes and mouth. He wore suspenders over a faded plaid shirt, and a pair of magnifying goggles hung around his neck like a relic of a forgotten craft. "You found an Everlast safe?" he asked when Caleb explained. His voice rasped like sandpaper but carried an amused spark. "Those things were built to survive the end of the world." Caleb nodded. "It's in the wall of a cabin built by Elias Greer." At the name, the old man's expression shifted. "Greer, you say? My father used to trade lumber with him. Fine carpenter. Odd fellow, though. Always talking about how the woods were listening. Haven't heard that name in 50 years. They rode back to the cabin in Caleb's truck. Echo curled in the back seat, his head resting on the windowsill. Arthur sat quietly, his hands folded atop his cane. When they arrived, the old man stepped slowly into the living room, eyes scanning the beams and nails with professional curiosity. "Solid work," he murmured. "But this wall, it's been patched. Whoever did it meant to hide something, not fix it." Caleb guided him to the safe. Arthur crouched, his joints creaking, and ran his fingertips along the dial. "Model 84B, he said after a moment. "This one's got a 5-disc tumbler. Can't be forced without ruining the contents." He fitted the magnifiers over his eyes, then pressed a small stethoscope to the door. The room fell into silence. Only the faint ticks of the dial and the soft rasp of the old man's breath filled the air. Echo watched intently, head tilted, tail twitching each time the dial clicked. Minutes stretched into an hour. Caleb's muscles stiffened from crouching, but Arthur remained perfectly still, lost in the language of tumblers and resistance. Finally, there was a heavy clunk, the sound of metal surrendering after decades of sleep. "There," Arthur said, his smile small but triumphant. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open. A cold, dry draft rolled out, carrying the faint scent of old paper and sunburned leather. Inside the safe lay a single object wrapped in yellowed cloth. Arthur stepped back, letting Caleb reach in. The bundle was lighter than it looked, and when he unwrapped it, the cloth fell away to reveal a thick, hand-bound journal. The cover was cracked, edges stained dark, but the initials E.G. were still visible, burned faintly into the leather. Caleb held it reverently, his fingers brushing the embossed surface. "Elias Greer's handwriting," Arthur said softly, adjusting his glasses. "Looks like he left you his confession, son." Caleb glanced at him. "Why me?" The old man shrugged, eyes distant. "Maybe not you in particular. Maybe just whoever had the guts to listen to this old house?" Echo rested his chin on Caleb's knee, tail flicking against the floorboards. The rain had started again outside, a slow drizzle whispering against the windows. The house groaned softly in reply, no longer a haunting but something like relief. Caleb closed the safe door gently, his reflection faint in the rusted steel, and whispered, "All right, Elias. Let's hear what you have to say." The cabin was hushed, except for the faint crackle of the fire Caleb had built to fight the damp. The leather-bound journal lay open across his lap, its yellowed pages trembling slightly each time the wind brushed against the chimney flue. Echo rested beside him, head tilted on his paws, amber eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. Outside, the pines swayed as if whispering to one another, their roots stirring the soil that hid too many secrets. Caleb ran his thumb along the first page of Elias Greer's journal and began to read. The early entries were ordinary: measurements, carpentry notes, a man's careful record of his days. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. "Something's wrong with the water," Elias had written in uneven strokes. "The trout are dying. I followed the creek upstream and found barrels marked with the hollow pines timber seal, the metals corroding, leaking a blue-green slime that stains everything it touches." Caleb paused, his chest tightening. He glanced toward the window, where the faint shimmer of that same sickly color glowed beneath the moonlight in the nearby creek. He turned the page. "They told me to keep quiet. Offered me money first. Said it was just runoff, nothing harmful. But the children in town are sick. The cattle won't drink. I took samples to the sheriff." The next line was smeared by water damage, but Caleb could still read the words beneath the stain. He returned them to me unopened. The following pages became darker, the handwriting more frantic. Elias wrote of men visiting at night, of threats muttered through the trees, of tools missing from his shed. "They say accidents happen in the forest," one entry read. "They say people get lost. But I know what they're doing. They're dumping the waste from their copper refinery. It's poison. The house creaks when the wind blows because the soil beneath it is hollow now, eaten away." Caleb exhaled slowly. The Helmholtz resonance, the breath-like sound. It wasn't just wind through decayed wood. It was the whisper of air through poisoned ground. He turned to the last entry, written in a shaky hand that pressed deep into the paper. "If I don't return, let the house breathe for me. Let its voice carry what mine could not. I buried the truth where it can still speak." He stared at the words for a long time, feeling their weight settle like cold iron in his chest. Echo stirred beside him and gave a low whine. Caleb reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "He wasn't crazy," he said softly. "He built this house to talk, to warn." A knock at the door startled them both. Caleb stood, heart hammering, and opened it to find Sheriff Clay Rourke standing on the porch. The man was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a square jaw hidden behind a silver mustache. His uniform jacket was worn but clean, the brass star dull with age. His blue-gray eyes were steady, but there was something, cautious, almost wary, behind them. "Evening," he said. "Saw your truck down at the library earlier. Mrs. Doss said you were asking about Elias Greer." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's right. I bought his cabin." The sheriff's gaze drifted past him into the dark interior. "Strange place to take up residence. Folks say it's bad luck. You hear the noises yet?" Caleb gave a faint, humorless smile. "I've heard them, and I know what causes them." The older man shifted his weight, boots creaking on the porch. "You should leave well enough alone. Some stories out here are better left buried." His tone wasn't threatening, but it carried an old fatigue, the voice of a man who'd chosen silence over conflict for too long. Caleb met his eyes. "Elias was trying to stop the poisoning of the creek. He died for it." For a long moment, the sheriff didn't answer. Then he sighed, removing his hat and rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "I was a deputy then. I remember the night he vanished. They told us it was an accident, but—" He looked toward the dark forest. "The company had half this town in its pocket. I wanted to do something, but I had a wife, a son. You understand?" "I do," Caleb said quietly, though his voice carried no forgiveness. "But understanding doesn't make it right." The sheriff's gaze fell on the journal in Caleb's hand. "You're not going to keep that quiet, are you?" "No," Caleb replied. "Elias built this house to speak. I think it's time someone listened." Clay Rourke stared at him for a long moment, then gave a small, grim nod. "If you're set on stirring up ghosts, be careful. Some of them are still alive." He stepped down from the porch and disappeared into the mist. Inside, Caleb set the journal gently on the table. The wind shifted, blowing through the reopened vent in the north wall. The house exhaled, a deep, resonant sigh that rippled through the floorboards. It no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like release. Echo tilted his head, tail thumping softly. Caleb whispered, "You did it, Elias." Your voice never stopped. Outside, the pines swayed again. The creek glimmered faintly green, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Caleb felt the forest breathe, not with menace, but with memory. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, sunlight glinting weakly off the wet pine needles. The air held a metallic chill, like the breath of something old being exhaled one last time. Caleb drove east toward Portland, the battered truck groaning against the climb. Echo rode in the passenger seat, his fur catching the morning light, calm but alert, watching the forest recede behind them. The journal of Elias Greer rested on the seat between them, bound in cracked leather and silence. Caleb had read it so many times the words were engraved in his mind, the confession of a man who had fought alone against power and poison. Now it was time to make sure his voice reached someone who could not ignore it. The headquarters of Hollow Pines Timber stood at the edge of the city like a fortress of glass and steel, polished and proud, pretending its roots were not sunk in rot. Caleb parked in the visitor lot, drawing glances from security as he stepped out, his boots caked with forest mud, his jacket old but neatly buttoned, the soldier in him still disciplined even in defiance. Echo followed quietly at his heel, tail low, every movement measured. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and disinfectant. A receptionist, a young woman with red hair and wary politeness, looked up. "Mr. Harlow? Mr. Clay will see you now." Harrison Clay waited in a vast office overlooking the Willamette River. He was in his mid-40s, tall, lean, and impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit that looked as though it had never known dust. His face was angular, his hair silver at the temples, his eyes a cool slate blue that betrayed exhaustion behind composure. He had the bearing of a man who lived his life surrounded by glass, always reflecting, never quite touched. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but not cold. "Sheriff Rourke said you'd be coming. He told me you have something that concerns my company's history." Caleb nodded, stepping forward to place the journal on the polished oak desk. "History's one word for it. Guilt might be another." He opened the journal to the last pages. "Elias Greer, carpenter, whistleblower, and the man your grandfather silenced when he found out this company was dumping copper waste into the creek that fed Hollow Pines." He turned the book toward him. "You can read it. Every word's still there." Harrison's gaze lowered to the yellowed paper. His hand, pale and precise, hesitated before touching it. He began to read silently. The minutes stretched. The ticking of a wall clock became the only sound. When he reached the final entry, he stopped. His shoulders seemed to deflate slightly, like a structure under too much weight. "My grandfather," he said finally, voice quiet but steady. "He built this company out of ambition and fear. My father inherited it and believed silence was loyalty. And me, I've inherited their ghosts." "I'm not here for revenge," Caleb said. "I'm not asking for money, either." Harrison's eyes lifted, narrowing slightly in suspicion. "Then what is it you want?" Caleb drew a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. "A fund," he said. "For the restoration of the Hollow Pines watershed, soil cleanup, new trees, safe water for the town, and a clinic, a veterinary and wildlife hospital, free treatment for animals poisoned by runoff. You'll sponsor it publicly, under your company's name. No lawsuits, no headlines, just restitution." Harrison studied him. Behind the calm professionalism, there was something haunted. A man who had spent his life justifying comfort built on other men's silence. "You think fixing a creek erases what's been done?" he asked quietly. "No," Caleb replied, "but it stops it from happening again. And maybe it gives meaning to a man who died trying to make it right." The CEO leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. The afternoon light cut across his face, revealing the faint tremor in his jaw. "My grandfather used to say the forest never forgets," he murmured. "I always thought it was poetry. Maybe it was a warning." He looked again at the journal, tracing Elias's initials with one finger. "How many others knew?" "Enough," Caleb said. "But they're gone now. You're the last to carry it." Harrison stood and walked to the window. Below, the river shimmered under the sun, pale and restless. "You know," he said softly, "the river runs through everything we build here. Through the lumber yards, the neighborhoods, the soil itself. If it's poisoned, then so are we." He turned back to Caleb, his expression resolute but heavy. "All right, we'll fund your proposal. The creek will live again. The clinic, too. I'll have my board draft the paperwork by next week." He gave a faint, almost human smile. "It's time the moss stopped hiding our sins." Caleb nodded once, relief washing through him like a tide retreating after a long storm. He closed the journal gently and slid it toward Harrison. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to your family more than mine." Echo gave a soft bark, as if sealing the decision. The CEO reached down to scratch behind the dog's ear, a rare gesture of warmth that softened his austere frame. "You're a good one," he said quietly to Echo. Then, to Caleb, "You've given me a debt to repay, Mr. Harlow, and a way to start paying it." When Caleb stepped back outside, the wind had shifted. The city noise faded beneath the hum of the river below. He looked toward the distant tree line, where hollow pines lay beyond the horizon. For the first time, the thought of that cabin breathing no longer filled him with unease. It felt like closure. Echo pressed close against his leg, tail wagging once before they walked toward the truck together. A year later, the hills of hollow pines looked reborn. The once tainted creek now ran clear as melted glass, cutting through the valley like a vein of silver. Wildflowers returned to its banks, and dragonflies hovered over the surface where poison had once lingered. The cabin, once shrouded in rot and rumor, stood renewed beneath the shade of the great pines. Its moss-covered walls had been cleaned but not stripped. Caleb insisted that the green remain, a living memory stitched into its wood. A carved sign now hung above the porch: Elias Greer Forest and Wildlife Rescue Center. Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Where the forest breathes again." Caleb stood on the porch, wearing a faded flannel shirt rolled to his elbows, the same jacket from his first winter now patched at the seams. His hair was streaked with gray, his beard short and clean, his posture calm, yet firm, like the trees around him. Beside him, Echo lay with his head on his paws, his fur touched with age. Still strong, still vigilant, eyes bright with the steady wisdom of a companion who had walked through darkness and come out into light. The air smelled of pine sap and rain-soaked soil. From the roof, the soft hum of wind through hand-carved wooden flutes filled the air. A project Caleb had designed himself. The sound replaced the old breath of the house. Now it wasn't a haunting. It was a song, carried by every breeze that passed. A group of visitors approached the cabin along the gravel path. Families, volunteers, and townsfolk. Among them was Nora Benton, a veterinarian in her early 30s with a sturdy frame, shoulder-length brown hair, and freckles across her sun-warmed face. Her eyes, a soft hazel, carried the grounded kindness of someone who had seen suffering and still believed in healing. She waved as she approached. "The new shelter wing's ready," she said, smiling. "We've already treated 2 foxes and a hawk this week." Caleb nodded, returning her smile. "Elias would have liked that," he said quietly. "He built this place with his hands. Now it builds something back." The children followed, laughing as they ran toward Echo, who lifted his head and gave a patient tail wag. A small boy knelt beside him, pressing his cheek to the dog's fur. "Is he the hero dog?" he asked, eyes wide. Caleb chuckled softly. "He's just Echo. But yeah, he's the one who found the truth." The boy grinned, and Echo licked his hand before resting his head back down with a satisfied sigh. The breeze shifted again, the flutes on the roof singing low and gentle. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Harrison Clay arrived. He looked different. Simpler clothes, sleeves rolled, the weight of corporate polish gone from his face. The Clinic and Restoration Fund had thrived under his sponsorship. The Hollow Pines River ran cleaner than it had in 50 years. He stood beside Caleb on the porch, watching the children play. "Funny," Harrison said, softly. "I used to think legacy meant what you built. Turns out it's what you repair." Caleb nodded. "You gave back what your family took. That's a start." Harrison's gaze lifted toward the wooden flutes on the roof. "You kept the sound." "Couldn't let it go," Caleb said. "The house used to breathe in pain. Now it sings in peace." As dusk settled, the last of the visitors left, leaving the valley quiet. The lights from the cabin glowed warm and golden, reflecting on the damp moss. Caleb sat on the porch steps, Echo resting his head on his boot. Fireflies drifted among the ferns. The wind came again, soft and steady, weaving through the flutes, turning breath into melody. Caleb watched the sky deepen to violet, the forest exhaling around him. he whispered. The house breathed and lived again. Echo's ears twitched at his voice, and for a moment his amber eyes caught the glow of the lanterns, reflecting the same green as the moss that had once covered every wound of this place. Somewhere within the trees, the river murmured, no longer poisoned, no longer angry. Its voice joined the song of the house, a harmony between wind, wood, and water. Caleb closed his eyes and listened, not for ghosts, but for gratitude. The sound was everywhere, gentle yet unending, like the forest itself giving thanks for a promise finally kept. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive as thunder or light. They come as whispers through the wind, as second chances hidden in the breath of an old house, or in the loyalty of a dog who never stopped believing. Caleb thought he was restoring a broken cabin, but in truth, he was restoring faith in people, in goodness, in the quiet mercy of creation itself. The forest healed because someone chose to listen. The river lived because someone refused to turn away. And maybe that's the message for all of us, that God still speaks, not from clouds, but through the ordinary, the kindness we show, the wounds we mend, the truth we carry forward. The miracle is not distant. It's here, breathing beside us, if only we stop long enough to hear it. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may hear the song of second chances. Leave a comment with where you're watching from, and let's fill this place with hope. Subscribe to the channel to walk with us in the next story of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God bless you and those you love. May He guide your path as He guided Caleb's, through silence into light.